Hello, and welcome to this edition of Psycho Killer from me, Simon Ford.
And me, Jacques Morrell.
Depraved and vile are two of the adjectives being commonly used to describe David Fuller, the 67-year-old hospital electrician who's admitted murdering two women in the 1980s and raping the dead bodies of at least 100 women and girls in the mortuary of the Kent-Sussex-Hospital at Tunbridge Wells.
Fuller escaped detection for 34 years, while police hunted the so-called Bedsit Killer. This man, who we now know was Fuller, raped and murdered 25-year-old Wendy-Knell and 20-year-old Caroline Pierce in two separate attacks in Tunbridge Wells in 1987. Both victims lived in a ground floor flat just a mile apart.
Fuller, from Heathfield in East Sussex, was caught thanks to advances in DNA testing.
Right, David, you're under arrest on suspicion of the murders of Wendy-Knell and Caroline Pierce in 1987. Do you understand? Yes. You do not have to say anything, but it may harm your defence if you do not mention, when questioned, something which you later lie in court. Anything you do say.
Fuller is being linked to the unsolved murder in 1986 of a 24-year-old bar worker, Linda-Cook, in Portsmouth. Her body was found on wasteland near where Fuller grew up. It was only when searching his house after arresting him for the Bedsit murders that detectives discovered Fuller had been sexually abusing the bodies of deceased patients over a period of something like 12 years. The police seized hard drives containing 14 million images of sex offences, including video Fuller took of himself in the hospital mortuary.
Confronted with this evidence, Fuller admitted abusing at least 100 corpses, including 3 children. Fuller worked regular night shifts, and his job as a technical supervisor gave him access to the mortuary when no other staff were on duty. He avoided detection by exploiting a blind spot in the morgue's CCTV. On camera, he appeared to be going about his legitimate work, and the abuse took place out of shot. Without the stash of sick home movies that he'd recorded, these offences might never have come to light.
Yes, the evidence of Fuller raping and sexually abusing the bodies of deceased patients in the mortuary was all gathered from videos and photographs that he himself had collected. There were thousands of videos and photos, hard drives full of digital images and footage, and a stash of printed photographs which showed in graphic detail the extent of his offending.
Now, as you would expect, Kent police have set up a hotline for people whose relatives' bodies might have been abused by Fuller in that mortuary. Maidstone and Tunbridge Wells NHS Trust has also commissioned an independent investigation into how the abuse happened and what could have been done to prevent it. And the Health Secretary, Sajid Javid, says the NHS has written to all trusts asking for mortuary access and post-mortem activities to be reviewed.
Even so, MPs in Kent and East Sussex say these steps simply don't go far enough. They're calling for a public inquiry. The Tunbridge Wells MP, Greg Clark, said the revelations were, quote, shocking and devastating, and we must establish that this can never happen again, unquote. Jack, what I find so striking about David Fuller is that superficially he was an extremely ordinary guy, what I call a beige man, right? And this is amply demonstrated by an interview given to the Daily Mail by one of his former mistresses. She described how he was, quote, the perfect gentleman and a quiet man, unquote, who was very cool and never lost his temper. Indeed, the only unusual aspect of his personality, as far as this anonymous woman was concerned, was that he preferred to drink peach schnapps and lemonade, whereas other men in their circle drank beer instead. And the photographs that have appeared in the media of David Fuller seem to reinforce the impression he gave of an honest, clean-living guy. You know, he enjoyed countryside and outdoor pursuits like cycling.
Yeah, that's right. But remember, what we know about psychopaths They can disguise their true emotions and mimic other people's so they blend in with the crowd. And the evidence that's coming out suggests that David Fuller has the hallmarks of a classic sociopath. There are clearly elements of his personality and his past that align closely with Professor Bob Hare's revised psychopathy checklist. We know that Fuller had difficulty maintaining stable long-term relationships. He was married 3 times. He was promiscuous. During those marriages, he had multiple extramarital affairs, which he managed to keep hidden. The impression that Fuller gave was of a quiet gentleman, and yet he had a rapacious sexual appetite and was incapable of being in a monogamous relationship.
Okay, sure, but if someone sleeps around, it doesn't necessarily follow that they're a psychopath, does it? So what other red flags were there?
Well, we also know that Fuller racked up quite a criminal record when he was in his 20s. In 1973, he was convicted of 26 counts of burglary, and he was also known to the police at that time as a peeping Tom. Now, at the time when he was living with his parents in Angerstein Road, Portsmouth, he was not far away from Linda Cook, the bar worker who was murdered in 1986, and her body was dumped about a mile away in Lake Road.
Fuller's previous offences have only been made public since he admitted the Bedsit murders. We can only assume that his employers didn't know about his criminal record, or they thought it was so old it didn't matter. I suppose you could say these convictions were spent. Either way, potentially, I think somebody gave David Fuller a second chance. Maybe he convinced the rest of the world that he'd turned over a new leaf, and then he moved on to Heathfield in East Sussex.
Well, exactly that, and to all intents and purposes, Fuller had turned his life around. He'd left behind the petty crime and the voyeurism and became a respectable member of society. Yet all the time, he harboured the knowledge that he was the Bedsit Killer. Not only that, every day, or should I say every night, when he went to work in that hospital, he was able to commit the most atrocious crimes against dead bodies without any checks or balances or scrutiny or observation or any form of supervision whatsoever.
The bigger question in my mind is how many men, and it is generally men who are sociopaths, are going about their daily business right now, unobserved and undetected. Granted, they may not have committed arrestable offences, but they have the potential to be criminals. And I suppose if they do turn to crime, their offences might not be as grievous as the crimes of David Fuller. Someone can be a psychopath without being a rapist, a murderer, or a necrophile. However, I wonder if it isn't time to draw a line in the sand and set up some kind of screening program to weed out potential psychopaths and create a national database to track their activities. And this information could be collected in the same way as DNA is collected from a suspect who's arrested and questioned. And the result of a PCLR test could then be attached to their biometric data on the same file, a psychological fingerprint, you might say, to accompany their unique physical identifiers.
Well, we have a couple of stumbling blocks here. First of all, the Hare psychopathy checklist isn't a self-reporting system. The person being evaluated doesn't answer the questions, as in the case with other psychological tests. It's more a qualified psychologist or psychiatrist familiar with the evaluation procedure completes the assessment based on an in-depth interview and review of the information contained in the person's records. It's not like taking a DNA swab. There simply isn't time to do this properly in the custody suite. And then, of course, there's the civil liberties angle. On what grounds could psychological data be gathered, stored and used? It sounds like you want to invent a department of pre-crime, a bit like in the movie Minority Report. And even if science fiction becomes scientifically possible, the ethics around its application would be questions for Parliament. Your suggestion calls into question principles like prior restraint and free will. It's the kind of debate that would define generations. It's the line between democracy and autocracy.
So you're saying in order to live in a free society, we have to accept, do we, that the David Fullers of this world deserve the same freedoms as the rest of us, and they can only be prosecuted after the fact. We've got to allow them to commit their crimes before we can punish them.
Well, that's the law, and like any law, it's fallible, but it's better than the alternative, in my view.
Which I suppose is the message of Minority Report, because the character behind the whole fictional pre-crime system was himself a psychopath who'd stop at nothing to protect the system that he created.
Yep, indeed. Now that concludes our discussion about the David Fuller case. Please do share your views on Twitter. We're at psychokillerpo.
Or you can contact us through our website, psycho-killer.com. For now, it's goodbye from us. We'll see you again soon on the dark side for another Psycho Killer shocking true crime story.